Welcome to the workshop. Hi, today we're going to make a Fox Wedged mortise and tenon, and I've begun by preparing a stub mortise and tenon in the way I show in my other video, and there should be a link on screen here that you can find that video. Watch that, create your own stub mortise and tenon like this, and I'll take the instruction on from that point. This is a normal mortise and tenon, stub mortise and tenon. We have one component here with a mortise made in it, the second component coming at right angles with a tenon on it, and we hold the tenon back slightly from the base of the mortise to allow for a bit of glue squeeze in there, and to make sure we don't ground out the joint before we've got a tight fit along these lines. To be able to make it into a wedged tenon, we need to slope the sides of our mortise. I go for roughly a slope of 1 in 7, and that's shown by the dotted line, and we remove those with a mortise chisel like so. Then I drill a couple of small holes, roughly 1/4 inch, 5-6 mm in from the edges of the tenon, and then saw a intersecting saw kerf through to the hole. That separates off these two edges of the tenon, and the holes provide a little bit of strain relief. And then if we drive a wedge in that saw kerf, the edge of the tenon is squeezed out to produce the dovetail shape. The finished joint should look something like this. The shaded blue area is the wedge that we need to create, and you can see it's driven home by virtue of the fact that it bottoms out in the mortise. It does mean we have to be very accurate in creating the right shape wedge compared to the slope on the edges of the mortise. Otherwise, either the flare on the tenon won't be enough to contact the edges of the mortise, or it will be too tight and we won't be able to drive the tenon fully in. Measurement for the wedges, which is so critical, is best made by making a drawing or laying out on the workpiece itself. In this drawing, the dotted line is representing the new mortise shape, but it also gives us the slope and the rough shape of the wedge. The only difference between this triangle here and the wedge shape is the fact we have to add on a saw kerf in width. That gives us enough material overall to squeeze the edge of the tenon right up close to the end of the mortise. On my workpiece, I've drawn out first of all the stub mortise, and then I've created a slope of 1 in 7 using a bevel gauge, which is this line here and that one, and I'm showing the base of the mortise with this line. That was measured using some calipers, depth gauge on the calipers, and just drawn in. I've kept the tenon a little short to make sure we can fully seat the tenon in the mortise and to allow for a bit of glue squeeze out. And I've prepared a little piece of waste here which fits quite nicely into our mortise, and that's what we'll use to prepare our wedges from. We want long grain material for our wedge, so this is ideal. The length that we want of the wedge, to begin with, I prepare it the full depth of the mortise. So I can easily mark that out by inserting the wedge fully in there. Take my marking knife and just mark a line. Now I can cut this off at that length and then cut my wedges. I know that my wedge wants to be the width of a saw kerf at one end, and then the width of a saw kerf plus this measurement here on the layout triangle. I've marked lines for the saw kerfs about 1/4 of an inch from each end of the tenon, and I'm now going to drill a relief hole near the end, up close to the shoulder. Now I'll pop it in the vise and cut these kerfs. The width of the kerf, when we're using a Japanese saw like this, is very thin, probably in the region of about, let's see, 1/2 millimeter. So that's all we need to add on to the width of our wedge that we laid out on the picture of our mortise. Using a bevel gauge, we can lay out a slope of 1/7, holding it 1/2 millimeter back on the knifed line we made for our mortise length. Make a mark. That will give us one wedge. Then with a square, using the same slope that we'll cut, adding an extra 1/2 mil for the saw kerf we're going to lose when we cut this in half. So I want a wedge that ends with 1 mil this time. Mark that one. And if I cut this wedge off first, keeping the line on the edge of the saw kerf, that's the one wedge, and I'll quickly run a plane along that edge just to smooth it, and cut this line. We'll have two identical wedges at the right slope. There's our one wedge. And there's our second wedge. So now we have our mortise, we have our tenon, we have one wedge and a second wedge. The next thing I want to do is just cut the tip off the wedge, because we don't want to run that tip right the way to the back of the hole that we've drilled. It's not important how much we cut off here now, because the important part is the width of the wedge here, the slope, and that will give us the right angle on the edge of the tenon. Now I've just cut a couple of mil off the end of the wedges, which will avoid us having the possibility of getting to the ends of our relief holes. I think you can see as long as the wedges are no longer than the actual tenon, and we have a gap between the tenon and the bottom of the mortise, there's never going to be a problem with getting the tenon all the way home. I've just sneaked the wedges in very slightly so that they now hold in place, and I want to make sure that the joint is going to go together without them falling off. So I'm just inserting them into the mortise and just making sure also that that hasn't spread the end of the tenon too much to get it in, and that's gone in about 1 millimetre, so that's really good. Now if I pull it out and the wedges are still in place, then I know I can go ahead, glue up and squeeze the joint home. And yep, they're still in place. So I'm going to put some glue on both on the surfaces of the wedges and on the tenon itself, and then we can knock this joint home. The last thing to do is to complete the mortise. That's the slope we're trying to get inside our mortise, and the marks I made earlier unfortunately are on the other side of the star, but that's the angle we're looking for. And on this side, like so. As I chop away, I can drop my bevel gauge into the mortise and slide up against the end wall, and once that slope has got to the right angle, the blade of the bevel gauge will come right to the end of the mortise. And I can lay the bevel gauge up next to the work to give me an idea of the angle to use my chisel at. But we'll sneak up on the exact slope. Come back around this side. I should say I've probably only used this joint in a piece of furniture twice at most. I've practiced cutting it a few times in the past, but I probably haven't cut it for a few years now. But I think once one understands the theory of widening the tenon to create the sort of dovetail shape, it's reasonably easy to work out how to cut it. And that looks good. So I'll just tip out the rest of the waste and then I can assemble the joint. It does take obviously a fair bit more pressure because you have to force the wedges up into the saw kerf as well as pushing the joint home. Clamping above a leg means nothing's going to move, and I can put some force down on it. So we need to glue up here. The best way I find to do this to make it less messy is to glue inside the mortise on the cheek walls, to put some glue in the kerfs and a little bit on the wedges, and then assemble it like that. Squeeze some glue down into the kerfs, and that holds the wedges. Once the wedge has been driven home, that makes it impossible for the wedges to come out, and we just put a little bit of glue on the wedges themselves. That will act as a bit of a lubricant hopefully when we try to put the joint together. And let's put it together. If you can see that, hopefully. We'll leave that to dry. The nature of the joint means there's really nothing to see when it's put together. So what I've decided to do is to cut straight through the joint. And that looks pretty clear to me. You can see how the wedges are driven all the way to the stress relieving hole we made. They're seated well at the back of the mortise, and they've spread the edges of the tenon up into the sides of the mortise, providing the dovetail shape and preventing the joint from coming apart. The Fox Wedged mortise and tenon. Give it a go.